Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm joined by Dr. Amy Karofsky to discuss her book, A Case for Necessitarianism, published with Routledge. For the audience, I've linked the book in the description. So thank you, Dr. Karofsky, for coming on, and maybe you could tell the audience a bit about who you are and what you do.
I'm a professor of philosophy at Hofstra University. I've been there for 26 years. I started off doing a lot of history of philosophy, especially the rationalists, and eventually moved on to considering the more contemporary theories of contingency, and came to discover that none of them could work. And then found myself thinking about necessitarianism, and the more I thought about it, the more it made sense to me.
Interesting. Well, that's the topic of today. I'm going to title this video kind of interestingly. It's going to be something like, you must watch this video or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yes,
So
exactly.
now you guys understand that that was not a clickbaity title. It makes sense because we're talking about necessitarianism. Let's move on to the kind of key terms for our discussion. We need to lay the groundwork for the ensuing discussion of arguments for and against necessitarianism. I guess first up is the kind of modal terms of necessity and contingency, or something being necessary or contingent. So could you take us through what those mean?
Okay, so yeah, typically in at least contemporary philosophy, what is necessary is such that it can't be otherwise in any way whatsoever, and what is contingent is such that it could be otherwise in some way. Um, what's interesting is that when people start working with the terms necessity and contingency, sometimes they'll start talking about different forms of necessity. And on my account, if any so-called necessity is contingent in any way, I count it as a contingency and not a necessity. So that's one interesting point to keep in mind.
Yeah. Okay, so as I understood it, a necessary thing or something which is necessary is such that it is, but it can't be otherwise in any way whatsoever. And a contingent thing, as you said, is something which is, but it could have been otherwise in some way or another. And so just to foreshadow for the audience, given that articulation, a necessary entity, in principle, can be such that it depends on another. It can be such that it comes into existence or ceases to exist. It can be such that it changes. It's just that any changes that it undergoes, anything about it, could not have been otherwise in any way, shape, or form. But it still could be dependent on another. It still could be, etc. So that's a clarification that we'll get to later as well. So, okay, so we've got these two terms, necessary and contingent. Now let's move on to necessitarianism and contingentarianism. So can you take us through these two theses?
Absolutely. So let me start with necessitarianism. In general, I take my account of necessitarianism to be very much like Parmenides' account and Spinoza's account. Although as an atheist, I don't think that the universe is God in the way that Spinoza maintains. I also take necessitarianism to be very straightforward, common sense account of the world. So like Parmenides, I just think that what is, and that's it. So there have been some other ways that necessitarianism gets described, and I think we're going to talk about those in a second. But let me just talk about contingentarianism. Contingentarianism, interestingly enough, I had to come up with that term. There really wasn't a name for it in the entire history of philosophy. And so I use contingentarianism because at least most contemporary philosophers believe that a contingency is something that could be otherwise. So contingentarianism is the view that at least one thing in the world could be otherwise than what it actually is.
Awesome. Yeah. So contingentarianism is, as you just said, something could have been otherwise. That's the basic thesis. And the necessitarianism is nothing could have been otherwise. So can you take us through, I guess, how you articulate necessitarianism? Then maybe we'll go through some kind of equivalent ways to put it, but that are cached in terms of like possible worlds and so on.
Yeah. So, it's an interesting thing. Now that I've finished this case for necessitarianism, I've kind of found myself thinking that I can now, in that kind of Wittgensteinian way, throw away the contingentarian ladder. And As I've started thinking about that, I've noticed more and more how many theories, how many claims, especially in contemporary philosophy, rest upon the presupposition that contingentarianism is true. And so we then just start taking things for granted, like we can use possible worlds to describe certain states of affairs, and that there's a difference between, say, necessary truth and truth. But now that I've thrown that contingentarian ladder away and I no longer have to use contingentarian language, it actually turns out that all I have to say is that the world is as it is. For the world to be as it is the same as to say that it is actual, it is true, it is what is in fact the case, and it is existing. All of these actually amount to the same. And so in many ways, I don't need to get into many of the distinctions that the contingentarian philosophy starts to require or presuppose.
Yeah, that's good. So just because my audience is probably comprised mostly of contingentarianism, I thought I'd give some kind of a maybe equivalent ways of stating it in their kind of favored terminology. So, as you state it in the book, it's just, yeah, as we both have said, nothing could have been otherwise in any way whatsoever. That's the thesis. But equivalent ways that I think my contingentarian audience might appreciate is like something. Here are a few. The actual world is the only possible world. Or what's never actual turns out to be impossible. So anything that's never actual is actually impossible.
That's
So
right.
that's another way to put it. Another way to put it is every truth is necessarily true.
Good.
So that's another way to put it. A still further way to put it is that the way things are is the only way that they can be. And then a still further way to put it is the final one for the audience is that the only possible way that reality could be is the way that reality in fact is. So that's the kind of general thesis that we're trying to get at. I don't know if you have anything to add on that before we get into other stuff.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So, I mean, I might just note that, again, you can hear some of the contingentarian language in there, especially the actual world is the only possible world. And of course, for the necessitarian, there are no other possible worlds. So that just is the claim comes out to just the claim that the actual world is the actual world. And the same for the claim that every truth is necessarily true. The necessitarian doesn't make a distinction between truth and necessary truth. So that claim just comes out to be the claim that every truth is true. And it really, in that sense, it's that straightforward account. Just one other way that we might think about it is just straightforwardly, it's really just repeating what you just said, that the disagreement between the necessitarian and the contingentarian concerns whether reality includes never actualized possibilities. Or ways things could have been. And the necessitarian maintains that the never actual is impossible, as you said, and there are no ways things could have been. And the contingentarian maintains that at least some entities that are never actual are possible.
Awesome. So still some further clarifications for the audience, just because I know that this territory is vexed. So I really think it's important to offer these clarifications at the outset so that we can rid ourselves of confusion, which is one of the goals of my channel, to rid ourselves of confusion. Okay, so maybe you can clarify how necessitarianism relates to fatalism and also how it relates to determinism. So I'll
Great.
turn it over to you for that.
Great. Yeah, it's interesting when I talk about this theory to my colleagues, to other philosophers. The first thing they kind of think about it or ask me is, oh, so does that mean that everything was supposed to happen? Or they'll make jokes in the hallway and say, well, you were meant to do this. So and I actually don't think that necessitarianism entails that form of fatalism. So fatalism is sometimes taken to mean what is meant or supposed or fated to happen. And I don't think that necessitarianism entails that. There's another version of fatalism that suggests that true propositions about the future are true now, and I do think that that is the case. And sometimes fatalism is also taken to mean that no one is able to act otherwise than what they do. And the necessitarian would accept that as well. But that what was meant to happen or supposed to happen it seems to suggest that there's some higher power or God that created or the universe or designed it. And again, as an atheist, I just don't think that the universe was created or designed. Necessitarianism doesn't entail that everything happens for a reason, if by reason we mean some ultimate purpose. But if reason is just the factors that lead up to something happening, then that's a fine account. I can say then that everything happens for a reason if we just mean, yeah, there's an explanation for why things happen. Similarly, necessitarianism does not entail that it doesn't matter what we do or that what happens was going to happen anyway. That's kind of that account of fate that doesn't seem to make much sense. I can't, if I'm going to go do something later, it's not like it's just going to happen anyway. I actually have to do the things that come before it in order to make that happen. So it really does matter what I do because that's how things happen. As for determinism, so determinism is typically, especially what also is called human determinism, it is typically the position that we don't have free will because the principle of universal causation is true. So if the principle of universal causation is true, that means every event has a cause. And if human actions are events, then that means that every human action has a cause. And that would seem to suggest that we don't have free will. And so that is the one way to characterize human determinism. I don't think we have free will, but I'm not so sure I'm a determinist because I'm not so sure I accept the principle of universal causation. And here's why. If the principle of universal causation means that every event has a cause, that seems to suggest that we can somehow isolate an event and isolate a cause and make them two distinct entities, and distinguish them not only from each other, but also from other causes and other events. And I'm not so sure that that's possible. In other words, I'm not so sure that we can isolate a cause or an event. And so if the PUC, if the principle of universal causation requires that there are distinct causes and distinct events, then I don't think that there's genuine causation in that way. So I tend to agree with Hume on that. But here's the thing: in the history of philosophy, earlier philosophy, cause was interpreted in other ways, and in particular, earlier philosophers took cause to mean explanation. So we see that specifically in Aristotle, and then many of the theistic philosophers will follow that account, that cause means explanation. And in that sense, to say that there's a cause for something's happening, well, that just means that there's an explanation for why it occurred. And on that account of cause, causal determinism would just amount to the claim that there is an explanation for what happens. And in that sense, the PUC would be pretty much the same as the principle of sufficient reason. And so on that interpretation, I would actually accept the principle of universal causation, if it does amount to the same as the principle of sufficient reason.
Yeah, and just for the audience, I just want to highlight that there are different senses of determinism at play in the philosophical literature and just at play in general. So I just want to clarify that whenever you hear determinism, you should probably, if you're in a conversation, you should probably get clear on what that means, because again, there are different notions. As you were articulating it, is a kind of particular brand of determinism, like Humean, or some people might say like hard determinism, or other sorts of ways to articulate it. Other people, like Peter Van Inwagen, will just kind of give a characterization like, well, determinism is a thesis that the past, together with the laws of nature, strictly entail exactly one unique future. That's one way to articulate it. And then you can kind of leave open whether or not that's compatible with versions of free will and so on.
That's
So
right.
just for the audience, just be careful whenever you hear the word determinism, because it can mean different things. So okay, just wanted to highlight that. See, we're still removing confusions, which is great. I love it. That's part of the task of philosophy. Okay. The last thing in terms of clarifications, because I know that some people in my audience are already thinking this, they might be thinking like, hey, if a tensed view of time is true, like if there is kind of genuine temporal becoming in reality, if things really come into being and then pass away kind of dynamically, and if tense, like it will be the case and it was the case, etc., if these pick out like fundamental features of reality, Well, then again, reality is dynamic. Like the facts themselves change. So, for instance, it once was the case that P, but it is no longer the case that P, and we can suppose that it's presently the case that not P. So, for instance, like dinosaurs exist. That was the case, but it's no longer the case. But then P, let's say the claim that dinosaurs exist. So the thought goes that can't be necessarily true, right? Because if it used to be true, but it's now false, it's not necessarily true then. Like if it's necessarily true, it can't change in its truth value. If it changed, then it's no longer true, and it's not necessarily true. So how do you kind of render compatible, or how do you explain how necessitarianism is indeed compatible with a tensed theory of time in light of that kind of thought that is occurring in my audience's minds?
Good, good, really good question. I think I'm going to give two responses to this. I mean, the first is, as we said at the beginning, necessitarianism can allow for change. It's just that things will unfold in only one way. So yes, there were dinosaurs, there are no longer dinosaurs, but that's all consistent with necessitarianism. And then the other way, the other point that I might make is that we could timestamp any claim. So if we said, well, dinosaurs existed, and then we give the timestamp for that claim, and then we say, well, and today in 2023, dinosaurs don't exist, we can then assert that claim. And when we do that, those claims are going to be true forever. It will be true at this time that there are no dinosaurs. And even if there are dinosaurs, say, and I don't know, they come back or something in another 1,000 years, it'll still be true that there were no dinosaurs now. I might just add one thing. I'm starting to think that when we talk about truth, we should move away from the claim that truth is a property of proposition. So that might be part of the problem as well. I think that truth just aligns or is the same as reality, as what exists, as what is actual. I tend to think that our propositions are never, ever going to be able to adequately correspond to or express reality. And so there's no sense in talking about a true proposition. And we could get into that later, but that's something that
Interesting.
I've been thinking about a lot lately.
That is interesting. So, yeah, so just for the audience, because so now we'll be able to skip that when we go to arguments against necessitarianism. Change is perfectly compatible with necessitarianism. The necessitarian thesis, you can understand it as for any changes that occur, and of course any things that aren't changes, the way that they occur is such that it must have occurred that way, right? So they're not saying that changes can't occur.
That's right.
So things really can go out of existence and come into existence. It's
That's
just that the
right.
way that they do is such that it could not have been otherwise, that they do it in that kind of way. So I can still be born under necessitarianism. I can still die under necessitarianism. Things can change. It's just that the way that they change is such that it could not have been otherwise. It must have been that way. And
That's
things
it.
must have played out that way. So it's perfectly compatible with change. I just want to emphasize that for the audience.
That's it. That's it. I might say one thing though. There's sometimes the question about change in the future. Does the future change? So one of my colleagues asked me, well, why are you writing this book? You seem to be wanting to change someone's mind. But if you're changing someone's mind, aren't you then suggesting that there's two alternative futures? One where the person's mind is changed, with the other where it's not changed. And I would just say that no, I'm in that sense, if change has to mean that there are two alternative futures, then I won't accept it. But if what I'm doing, I'm trying to change a person's mind by affecting their views, so that they may believe that contingentarianism is true now, but I'm trying to affect their views so that they maybe reconsider it in the future.
Yeah, you're basically the agent by which what necessarily comes to pass does
Yeah.
in fact come to pass. So that's
Yeah.
that's sort of what's going on. Okay. Now on to the historical backdrop for necessitarianism slash contingentarianism. So again, my audience is going to be more because we're proper analytic philosophers here at the Majesty of Reason, so we don't care about history. No, I mean I'm kidding. That's a joke for the audience. But if you could just briefly touch on some of the historical aspects of necessitarianism and contingentarianism.
Yeah, so again, my early work in graduate school was on the modern philosophers and the medieval influence on them. At Hofstra, I teach ancient and medieval philosophy, so I've I am somewhat of a historian of philosophy. So I can kind of walk us through, and as I've been doing that work, I've also kind of watched out and to see where contingentarianism popped up in the history. So most of the ancient and early theistic philosophers tended to believe that everything is necessary. We see that in a lot of the pre-Socratic philosophers. They seem to just almost presuppose that, yeah, of course, things unfold necessarily. And we really don't see many claims about ways things could have been until about Aristotle, when Aristotle worries about whether the sea battle will happen tomorrow, and whether he can still maintain that every proposition is such that it's either true or it's false. So that's really one of the first places that it comes up. In the Middle Ages, we now get, the necessary being God included in the account of the universe. And many of those philosophers want to maintain that God has free will. But again, most of the earliest philosophers, including Augustine and others, still believe that that the universe was absolutely necessary, and in part because God is all-knowing. God knows how the universe is going to unfold. Sometime around the Islamic philosophers and then into Aquinas, philosophers start to think that there must be some free will in God, that God must have a choice about which universe to create or what essences to actualize. And that starts to really begin our discussion about contingency. But we see that most of those philosophers fail in the way that Spinoza does such a great job of showing that, again, if there's an all-knowing being, that being is going to know exactly what that being does. It's going to know that being's entire essence and how everything will unfold. And so it really doesn't seem that the theist can provide an account of contingency. So then we might jump to, so again, we get to Spinoza, who says, yep, there's just one universe that is God and everything is necessary. There's no free will. And then Hume comes in and says, but wait, necessity can't be demonstrated or even made plausible. And this ushers in an era of modal skepticism that includes philosophers like Frege and the logical positivists and Quine. And then with the work of Kripke and others on modal logic, we get a renewed focus on modal concepts. But it's really important to understand that as we start to develop modal logic, it operates on the contingentarian presupposition that there must be a difference between necessity and possibility. In many ways, modal logic is just the attempt to provide an account of the difference between necessity and possibility. Then, of course, David Lewis says, well, we need possible worlds. It's the best way to account for the way that we're thinking and talking about ways things could have been. And then most philosophers then start to reject the realism of possible worlds. But still continue to think that even though there's just the actual world, there still have to be ways things could have been. And so we see I would say almost every contemporary philosopher. I really have yet to see another contemporary philosopher who is defending the view of necessitarianism, at least to the extent that I am. So almost every contemporary philosopher believes that at least something must be otherwise. In the past 10 years or so, there's been an uptick in the mention of various forms of necessitarianism. Timothy Williamson is defending a necessitism. But again, none of those accounts amount to the strong necessitarian position that I'm defending.
Yeah, so just to interrupt, is that so necessitism, is that basically the thesis that each thing is such that that thing necessarily exists?
That's it.
But yeah, okay. And that of course by itself leaves open whether or not each of the ways that something is necessary. So each thing might be necessarily existent, even though all the ways that that thing is might in principle be contingent, right? So yeah. But you want to go even further and say, no, even the ways that things are, and not only are they necessarily existent in the sense that we've talked about, but they're also such that they could not have been otherwise.
That's it. That's
okay,
absolutely
sweet.
it. Yeah.
Okay, so that's some historical notes on necessitarianism versus contingentarianism. And now let's get on to the case for contingentarianism. And just to forewarn both you and the audience, there's a lot of stuff to get through, and we probably won't get through the arguments for and against Necessitarianism and for and against Contingentarianism. Probably not going to get through it all. If you guys are interested in this, again, check out the book in the description, Dr. Karofsky's book. You argue in your book, I guess we should explicitly state the thesis. I mean, you've already done it, but it's that necessitarianism is true and that the justification for contingentarianism is seriously lacking. So that's what we're going to be discussing. And we're going to be discussing in particular the attempted justifications for contingentarianism here. So I guess we can break these down into several families of arguments or motivations for contingentarianism. One of them is from experience. So for instance, you've got this argument from deliberation, and I take it that the basic idea here is that, like, when we deliberate, we seem to have, or at least take ourselves to have, leeway among alternative courses of action, right? We like reflect on and we reason about alternative options that we take to be genuinely open to us. Like, if we didn't take these alternatives to be genuinely open to us, well, then why deliberate about which option to take, right? So the basic idea is that in deliberating, we kind of presuppose alternative ways that things could go. And so a kind of like deliberation presupposes the falsity of necessitarianism. So what do you think about that?
Good. So here's what I think I'm doing when I'm deliberating. So I don't have alternative possible options in the future that I might take. What I have are some options in front of me. So if I am waking up in the morning and I'm thinking about what to eat, and I look in the fridge and I see I have some eggs, or I have a bagel, I have some cereal, those are options. And then I'm not a super fast computer, so it's going to take me a little while to kind of, think about what I had yesterday, maybe what I'm doing later. I might look at the eggs and say, oh, geez, wait, they're totally expired. I don't want them. That kind of computing and cost benefit analysis, weighing the pros and cons, takes me a little while. But as I go through that, I'm going to eventually land on one thing that I think is the one that I take to be the best option for me. And then I'm going to take that option because I think it's the one that I think is the best for me. And so that's all deliberation is. It's weighing the pros and cons, figuring out which one I most want or which one I think is the best for me at that time. And then that's the one I'm going to take.
Yeah. So I take it then that kind of the central response is this account of deliberation, and it kind of falls out of that account that you're not like committing yourself to there being like genuinely like real possibilities in which you choose otherwise than you in fact choose. Instead, you're kind of just like going through an epistemic process. It's like the alternatives are kind of epistemically open to you in some sense. Like, you don't yet know when you're deliberating which one is going to be the one to choose. So they're kind of epistemic possibilities in that sense. They're consistent with what you know at the time. And then deliberation is basically a process of closing off those various epistemic possibilities so that you get down to one. But you needn't thereby commit yourself to the real metaphysical possibility, the absolute genuine possibility that these other ways could have obtained. And you're still preserving the kind of phenomenology of deliberation. You're still just preserving our ability to deliberate among alternatives.
That's exactly it.
All right. So that's the argument from deliberation. Now let's move on to the, I guess, I kind of call this the argument from modal epistemology. I was just going to kind of verbally elaborate upon this. So I guess like a lot of people think that imaginability and conceivability kind of give us glimpses into ways that things could have been. So, you might think like you might imagine alternative routes to work. You might be able to imagine, and, oftentimes if you imagine a course of action that can kind of guide you in deciding what to do, and that can guide you. And like, it just seems like imagination is a crucial element in our deciding what to do and maybe even what we can do. So do you think that imagination and conceivability is like a good guide to possibility here? Like, what are your thoughts? How does the necessitarianism kind of just address imaginability and conceivability? So, I mean, the argument here, it sounds kind of question begging when I put it out in kind of format, but like the argument is basically imaginability is a good guide to possibility. The second premise would be something like, well, I can imagine alternative ways that reality might have gone. And since imaginability is a good guide to possibility, we have some reason to think that there really could have been these other alternative ways that are imaginable. And so we have some reason to think that necessitarianism is false. Now, again, I can see where you're going to respond, but I'll just turn it back over to you.
So it seems to me that when we claim that we can imagine a way that things could have gone, what we have is just kind of a vague but very incomplete account of whatever it is that we're thinking about. We're not going to be able to give an entire full account of that way that things could have gone. You might say, well, I could have just decided last minute not to do this, and I would not be here right now. And I can kind of imagine that, but I can't fill in all the details that would be needed to make it so that I actually was not here. I can just have this vague sort of idea of my not being here, but that doesn't mean that it's actual proof that I could have not attended this.
So this is where I was anticipating that you'd probably reject the argument. Like basically, either by like, okay, you're basically saying imaginability is not a good guide to possibility, because although you might be able to kind of vaguely imagine alternative ways that reality might have gone, I mean, it just falls out of your thesis that those really aren't ways that reality could have gone. So it falls out of your thesis then that imaginability, at least in that rough sense, is not a good guide to possibility. So it kind of just falls out of your view that that first premise is false. And so then kind of asserting that first premise is kind of just like assuming that you're wrong. So it's like you haven't really made the argument doesn't really make headway in the dispute, sort of.
Yeah, that's one of those times when you can kind of see that when you let go of that contingentarian ladder, yeah, you start to realize how often we seem to presuppose possibility and contingency, and when you become aware of it, you really start to see that so many of the arguments fall flat because of it.
Yeah, and interesting. So, I mean, you could also, as I'm reflecting further, you could kind of put your response in the form of the dilemma. When we're talking about imaginability, we're either talking about the kind of fully fleshed out, detailed imagined situation, or we're just talking about the kind of vague thing that you're saying. If we're talking about the kind of vague, yeah, I can imagine alternatives, then you reject that first premise that imaginability is a guide to possibility, because although we can imagine alternative ways that reality might have gone, it just falls out of your view that those really aren't possible ways that reality could have gone. But by contrast, so under that horn of the dilemma, you have a response to the argument. But under the other horn of the dilemma, where we're talking about fully kind of fleshed out, detailed, imagined situations, well, then you're probably going to reject that second horn of the dilemma. We actually can't fully flesh out, imaginatively detail alternative ways that reality could have gone. So then you then have a response to that second premise that I kind of articulated. So either way, whichever way we're talking about for imaginability, you kind of have a response to the argument.
That's it. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so continuing on with that modal epistemological style argument, some people think that we have kind of access to things as causal powers. So, for instance, if you take an individual die, it has certain causal powers. It has the power to roll a 1, or it has the power to roll a 2, or so on, together with other things rolling it, etc. So, a lot of people think that we can kind of use our access to causal powers to probe what's possible. And in particular, if we know that, for instance, the die has the causal power to land on a 6, but it in fact lands on a 3 on a given occasion, well, then we have some reason to think that it was at least possible that it landed on a 6 because it has that causal power. And so if it has a causal power, it's genuinely possible. So, and then I'll just kind of articulate how I put it in the document that I sent you. So let's just say the die lands on a 3.
Okay.
We might then reason from the fact that a die has 6 sides and in different situations actually lands on sides other than 3, to the conclusion that it really is possible that the die could have landed on something other than 3 on this occasion.
That's right.
So there are sort of two kind of separate arguments here. One is from the kind of causal power one. So we know that it has the power to land on a 6. So isn't it possible that it could have landed on a 6? Whereas the other one is, well, hey, in different situations, it actually does in fact land on a 6. And so we have a reason to think that on this occasion in which it lands on a 3, we have reason to think that the die could have landed on a 6 on this occasion. So I guess two separate brands of the argument, but I think your kind of the fallacy that you're going to pinpoint here applies to them both, but I'll just turn it over to you.
Okay, good. So I might respond to that in two different ways then. So first of all, thinking about causal powers, what's interesting about causal powers and dispositions is that most accounts want to say that what they're trying to do with causal powers and dispositions is provide a kind of necessary basis for natural laws. So if we look at a die and we roll it, the dispositionalist and person who defends causal powers is going to maintain that yeah, there's a certain way in which, given the universe, given that die, given the way that it's rolled, that it's going to land, and that results from the natural laws that are themselves necessary. But they take that next step and say, but because it has this certain power, it has a disposition, to land on any side. They want to say that well, that means that in any given situation, that die could land on any side. So if it lands on 3, well, that's what it did, but it could have landed on another one because it had the disposition or causal power to land on a 5, a 6, or any other number. So what they're trying to say is the mere fact that it lands on 3 doesn't mean that it was necessary, even though the way that it lands is generated or determined by necessary laws. And so what I see is an inconsistency there. They want to maintain that what happens in the world happens as of necessity, the necessity of the natural laws, and yet we could have an individual happen different than what it did. And the question is, yeah, but how would it do that? Well, if it really happened differently than what it did, some factor would have had to have been different. And that factor itself would have had to have had some factor that was different, and back and back and back. And that's not quite compatible with the account of causal powers and dispositions and necessary natural laws. So that's kind of the first point, that when the person who's defending causal powers really tries to account for the possibility, the actual possibility that the die that landed on 3 could have landed on 6, they're going to have a very hard time. But what they tend to do is not try to show that this particular die that landed on 3 could have landed on 6. Instead, what they tend to do is to back up and say, well, but this is a die, and a die has 6 sides. And anything that has 6 sides then could land on any one of those numbers. And in past times, this same die has landed on 6. And so then this particular rolling of die, which did land on 3, could have landed on 6. And I tend to call that existential quantification, possible instantiation fallacy. It's a terrible title, but I couldn't come up with a better one. Existential quantification, there are cases in which this particular die landed on something other than 3. Possible instantiation, so this die that did land on 3 could have landed on something other than 3. And my claim is that just because this particular die landed on 3 in past situations, that doesn't mean that this particular die that landed on 3 at this time could have landed on a different side. It's merely going from a general claim about this die and the way that it could land, or on other die and the way that they land, to a specific point about what this die could do. But just because other die have landed on sides other than 3, just because this particular die has landed on a side other than 3, that doesn't provide good evidence that this die could have landed on 3 in this particular situation, given these particular factors and the natural laws that are necessary.
Yeah, and I take it that it's going to be a similar response to the argument that I was going to cover next. So the argument I was going to cover next is basically like, well, hey, arguably there are certain like natural kinds of things like cats, dogs, etc. And a lot of these natural kinds seemingly have, like, the individual members of those kinds seemingly have non-essential properties. So like one cat might climb up a tree, so it has the property of climbing up a tree or whatever, and then another cat might never do that, so it doesn't have that property. And so you might think that because one cat has this non-essential property, well, then it's possible for cats in general to have that property. And so this other cat that didn't climb up the tree possibly, at least possibly, has that alternative property, which doesn't in fact obtain. And so then that would, if true, then there are ways that things could have gone that are alternative to the ways things actually go. But I think your response is going to be the same. Just because there are other cats that of which it is true that they possibly and indeed actually do that, it doesn't thereby follow by your lights that this particular cat is such that it could have gone up the tree.
That's
okay.
it. And then I'd point out, too, that, again, you can start to hear the contingentarian language, the contingentarian presupposition that there are non-essential properties. Almost every philosopher believes that not every property of an entity is essential. So you use that term non-essential property of the cat, that it might run up a tree, or it does run up a tree. That's, most take it that's not a necessary property of that cat. But again, when we take that contingentarian presupposition out, we start to see that we can't make that distinction between essential and non-essential properties. So that's one point. We probably get to that later. But then, as you said, just because we have cats and there are some cats that run up trees and some that don't, the one that doesn't run up the tree that doesn't mean that it could have, just because other cats do. Each cat is individual. Each cat has its own tendencies, its own ways of being. And so if a cat never runs up a tree, and it can't run up a tree, the mere fact that other cats can doesn't entail that cat could also possibly run up a tree. It might be easier to talk about even cat coat color. So, if I have a gray cat and I see an orange cat, well, I might think, again, because cat coat color, most people think is not essential. I might think, well, my cat could have been orange. It's possible that my cat was orange. But that seems to presuppose that contingentarian assumption that cat coat color is not essential. And that that existential quantification, some cats are not gray, possible instantiation, so my gray cat could have been not gray, is a fallacy. Just because certain cats are gray, that doesn't mean that some non-gray cat could have been gray.
Yeah. So as always, philosophical dialectic can continue beyond this point, but we, for the sake of time, have to move on. So, let's get on to probabilities and indeterminacies as an objection to necessitarianism. So I'm sure many people in my audience, maybe some of them have already furiously typed their objection, have already pressed enter, but they should have watched this point in the video. So, so the basic idea here is that, well, I think we're going to go through two kind of renditions of this sort of argument. So one of them is that our being able to quantify probabilities kind of presupposes modality. So I think Alexander Bird and maybe Timothy Williamson has also kind of pushed this line. So what is this line and how do you respond to it?
Okay, so especially Bird, Williamson, the idea is that we can look at a die again, and we can see that there's a probability that the die will land on 6, and that's a 1 in 6 probability. And most people will say then, well, then if you've got probabilities must entail then that the future is open, that there are genuinely possible ways that this die, before we throw it, could land. And we can even count them. There are 6 of them. But on my account, on the necessitarian account, probabilities are merely epistemic. We use them when we don't have all the factors in order to determine or figure out what side the die will land on. We know very little, actually. About all that we know is that this die has 6 sides, and we might know that it's a good die, that it will land on each of those 6 sides at some point or other. That's also sounding a little bit like contingency, but let me explain. But what we don't know are all the factors that are involved in this particular rolling of the die: the force with which I throw it, the number of times it's going to bounce before it finally settles down and lands. And so we have to use probabilities because we don't know all those factors. We probably can't know all of those factors. And so we appeal to probabilities to try to predict what will happen in the future. But that's not an indication that the future is genuinely open. It's merely an indication that we don't know all the factors that are going to result in how that die is going to land.
Yeah, so interestingly, this brings us to another kind of probabilistic objection, which is from the alleged deliverance from quantum mechanics of objective probabilities and objective chances. So some interpretations of quantum physics involve what we might say as indeterministic causation, where all the same initial causal conditions obtain, and yet a different effect or no effect at all might have obtained instead than the actual one that obtained. So indeterministic causation, then, one might think, requires a kind of contingency. And so then the idea is that for causation to be indeterministic really just is for there to be more than one physically possible effect arising from the same cause in the same total circumstances.
That's right.
And so it's going to be contingent, so the thought goes, that the electron was measured spin up rather than spin down. So how do you respond to this kind of quantum mechanics and objective tendency kind of objection?
Yeah, so again, I take it that the quantum mechanics and quantum physics accounts of indeterminacy, if that if it does mean that something happens for no determining cause or reason, the first thing I tend to say is that doesn't necessarily mean that it could have happened otherwise. We'd still need some proof or evidence that what doesn't happen for a cause or reason could have happened otherwise. So it doesn't prove that it couldn't have happened otherwise, but it puts the burden back on the indeterminist contingentarian who wants to maintain that what is indeterminate could have happened otherwise. So I think it's a really important point to make. We all seem to just, again, on this contingentarian presupposition, we tend to believe that what happens indeterminately must have been then capable of having happened otherwise. But that really actually would need to be proven before we could maintain that anything that happens indeterminately is contingent. So when we remove that contingentarian assumption, all we have left is, well, we have something that happens for no determining cause or reason, and that's it. And so that actually is consistent with necessitarianism. Until it's shown that it could have happened otherwise, we have no other reason to believe that it could have happened otherwise. So there's that point. And again, I think that what we're really doing in quantum mechanics and physics, and more quantum physicists are conceding this point, is, again, we're stating an epistemological stance. It's not a metaphysical point. It's really an epistemological point. We can't get in there to determine which way it's spinning, because if we get in there to try to figure out whether it's spinning up or down, we're affecting its spin. So that's the major problem. We can't get in there to see which way it's spinning. We know it's spinning either up or down, but that doesn't mean that it's spinning both up and down, or that it's if it's spinning up, it could have been spinning down. None of those conclusions follow from the fact that we don't know which way it's spinning. All that follows is that we don't know.
All right, so again, quantum mechanics is immensely complicated, and so are the metaphysical and modal-based debates that arise here. So for purposes of space, we're going to continue on to intuition. I think this is probably the first thing this is the first thing that came to my mind when I heard the necessitarian thesis. And the basic idea behind this motivation is just that, so the thought goes, it seems obvious that there's contingency. Like, I often give the example of me wiggling my finger. Like, it really seems that I genuinely could have maybe wiggled it one more time than I in fact did. Maybe at that point I just did. Someone in the audience is probably counting, but maybe I just did 33 wiggles. It seems like it could have been 34. Like, 33 is so arbitrary. It surely could have been 4 or 34 or 32. And moreover, the speed at which I did it, like, surely, like, it just phenomenologically seems that I could have done it slightly faster. Like, it just seems like I could have done that. I could have chosen that. But I didn't in fact do it. So it just really strongly seems, so the thought goes, that there's contingency. So how do you respond to this kind of intuition-based argument?
Yeah, and I get it. Believe me, I get it. I do think that there's that initial, yeah, but of course things could have been otherwise. Of course you could have wiggled your finger just one less time. It just feels that way. But even when I'm talking to my non-philosopher friends and we start to really analyze the example just like that, we come to find that, well, wait, in reality, if we really think about what went on as you were wiggling that finger, why you wiggled it in the way that you did, how you wiggled it in the way that you did, we start to see that, yeah, actually, it couldn't have been otherwise, that there's just no way to really account for one more wiggle than what you did. There's if we really work it out, think about how that happened, think about why you did it, the processes that were involved, you're going to find that you actually can't make it be the case that you wiggled it one more time than you actually did in that same exact circumstance. So I do think too that, especially for philosophers, so my non-philosopher friends tend to pick this up a lot more quickly. That is, they tend to be able to see that, yeah, wait, things really couldn't be otherwise. My philosopher friends are a little bit slower, but I actually think that that's just because that's how we've all learned as philosophers. We've all learned contingentarianism. We were all taught contingentarianism. We were taught to believe it. All of what we read, all of our accounts about how the world works, and even our systems of logic, modal logic, predicate logic, propositional logic, are all resting on contingentarianism. So it's I think it's really hard for philosophers to start to move away from what they've always known, always learned, and I think it's actually surprising for some philosophers to even realize that that they're operating on contingentarianism. I've had quite a few say, "Oh, you're right. I've just always taken it for granted that some things are contingent, and that necessitarianism is obviously false." And so I think that's part of what's playing into philosophers' intuitions, is the way that we're taught and that we teach each other.
That gets into the next objection, which is like majority belief. So the idea here is that the fact that almost all experts in a field accept something is powerful evidence for that thing. So that would be the first premise. The second premise is that almost all experts in philosophy, and in particular in like modal metaphysics and modal logic, accept contingentarianism. Therefore, we have powerful evidence for contingentarianism on our hands. So I'm guessing you're going to give a similar response.
Yeah, and again, I mean, so all experts in philosophy, it would have to be all contemporary philosophers. The ancient philosophers thought that things happened as a matter of necessity, that it was just taken, that's was pretty, just pretty straightforward account of the world. Many of our early medieval philosophers believed that things happened in the future unfolded in just one way, that things were necessary. They didn't think necessity was some really difficult modal concept that was impossible to provide an account of. And it's only once we start getting into the discussions about divine free will and human free will, really, that we start to get these notions of contingency. So it's not the case that every philosopher believed that there was contingentarianism, but especially after Hume and the periods after that up till now, that's what we know, that's what we've learned, and that's why we have a majority of philosophers believing it. It's interesting because I was just doing a symposium about a month or so ago, and one of the speakers said that at the beginning of all of her semesters, she implores her students to think critically about the positions and beliefs that they hold, to really be open to at least considering the beliefs that they just take to be absolutely false. And when we invited her to speak, she admitted that she actually had never taken her own advice. She never ever thought of a world in which there's no contingency. She never ever thought of taking necessitarianism to be true. So there are a lot of philosophers, I think, that are like that.
Yeah. Okay. So I think three more objections, and then we'll get on to probably. So we will get on to some of the motivations for necessitarianism. So, I think one of the main tasks of trying to convince someone of necessitarianism is removing all the barriers to it from the get-go. I guess I should say for the audience, while I am not a necessitarian, I really appreciated Dr. Karofsky's book because it just highlighted the need to justify contingentarianism, and also highlighted the difficulty of justifying it. So it can kind of awaken you from your dogmatic slumbers, as Kant famously said with respect to Hume. So that's something, and that's an achievement in itself for a book, I think. So I'll just say that for the audience so people don't get confused. But okay, so the next three objections are, the first one is basically like, hey, talk of contingency. So speaking about ways things could have gone, or alternative ways that things could have gone, and it being genuinely possible for things to have gone differently, that kind of talk seems intelligible. We seem to be able to make good sense of it. And moreover, it might form an indispensable part of certain like theoretically fruitful domains. So we might think that like history and psychology and biology and maybe branches of philosophical debates, we might think that like talk of contingency is indispensable to like theoretically fruitful progress in these sorts of fields. And maybe that gives us good reason to think that there really is contingency. So It's kind of similar to an indispensability argument for like mathematical Platonism. Some people argue that like, hey, mathematics and mathematical truths and like commitment or quantification over mathematical objects is indispensable to our best science. And because science is so successful, that gives us some reason to think that there really are such things as mathematical objects. Maybe so the thought goes is because contingency talk is both meaningful, or at least apparently meaningful, and indispensable to like theoretically fruitful domains of inquiry, maybe both of those give us some reason to think that, hey, there really is contingency. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, so the types of arguments that are oftentimes put forth in support of contingency, you're right. A lot of them appeal to contingency talk. We need contingency in order to be able to make sense of especially counterfactuals. If I hadn't been invited to your channel today, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Seems to be the type of counterfactual that everybody wants to maintain is true. And so because we think that that's true, we think that there has to be some types of contingent entities that can provide the basis for that truth or something along those lines. So if I were to think about from the necessitarian position that counterfactual, if you hadn't invited me to come on your channel, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Taken literally, I'm going to say it makes no sense. It is actually meaningless because it doesn't make any sense to even consider what happens in a situation that never occurs. The situation never occurs. We can't really know what happens in it. But I do think that what happens when we utter a counterfactual, like if you hadn't invited me on this channel, we wouldn't be here today. I think what we can do is to say, why do we think that that's true? And I think that most people are going to say, well, we think that that's true because, well, with a lack of invitation means that you're not going to have that conversation. And so there's this general claim, whenever there's no invitation, then there can't be that conversation between the two people. And that's a general claim, which is actually true. But that's really what I think all that we're saying with that counterfactual, that, yeah, whenever somebody doesn't invite somebody on their channel, well, then there's not going to be a conversation on that channel. That's a true claim, no problem. But that claim is no longer counterfactual. It's a general claim. And general claims can be true, and that one, tends to be true. We can say in general, when somebody doesn't invite someone to their channel, you won't have a conversation. But that doesn't then entail the counterfactual that had I not been invited, I wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Again, that's a discussion about what never happens in situations that never occur. And that seems to be meaningless. We can't know what never happens. We can't even have truths about it. So the only way to make sense of it is to try to see what are we saying about the actual world.
Yeah. Okay. The final two objections are closely related. They have to do with moral responsibility. So that kind of, well, they're one family of objections. So the first one derives from the ought implies can principle, and the second one derives from the principle of alternative possibilities. So I'll just run through the first objection here, because this is another one. This is the kind of second one after intuition that immediately came to mind when I heard about necessitarianism. So we could basically give a sort of argument employing ought implies can for the truth of Contingentarianism. And for the audience, I'll explain what ought implies can means. So we could say the first premise is something like, hey, here's a plausible premise. Ted Bundy ought to have refrained from murdering people. We might think that seems really plausible. The second premise is that if some agent ought to phi, where phi is some action or omission, if some agent ought to phi, then that agent could phi. Okay, so that is the ought implies can principle. It's basically if someone ought to do something, then they can do it. And the kind of motivation behind this ought implies can principle is that we often give excuses and excuse one another on the basis of claims that seem to rest on the ought implies can principle. So, for instance, imagine that I'm tied to a chair, and so I don't pick you up from the airport when I said I would. You get mad, of course, and you ask me, hey, Joe, why didn't you pick me up from the airport? It seems very natural to say in response, I couldn't help it. Like, I couldn't have done otherwise. Like, so it's not my fault that I couldn't have picked you up. I was tied to a chair. Or you can imagine someone complaining that I'm a lifeguard and can only save one of two people, both of whom are drowning. When I save one of them, surely I'm not to blame for not saving both of them. And plausibly, this is because I simply couldn't have saved them both. Right. So it's like, don't blame me for not saving one of them. Um, okay. So from those first two principles, firstly, that Ted Bundy ought to have refrained from murdering people. And secondly, that if some agent ought to fie, then the agent could have fied. It follows that Ted Bundy could have refrained from murdering people. Premise four, but Ted Bundy did not refrain from murdering people, quite evidently. Um, and so if Ted Bundy did not refrain from murdering people, but could have refrained from murdering people, well, then Contingentarianism is true. And so Contingentarianism is true. So what do you make of this objection?
Yeah, so okay, so in many ways, I think that there kind of needs to be a premise coming before your first premise. We can call it 1A or 0. In that in general, people ought not to murder other people. So there we have that general claim. And then two, the second premise that you gave, that if some agent ought to do phi, then that agent could do phi. Well, I take that to just be false. It presupposes contingentarianism. For the necessitarian, to say that a person ought not to do something merely means that in the case that they do it, something needs to be done. In particular, and at least initially, quarantining the person so that they, especially if they did it intentionally, so that they don't do it again. But in that case, then three doesn't follow. Indeed, I think that third premise is also false. That third premise was Ted Bundy could have refrained from murdering people. Um, the fourth premise is fine. Ted Bundy did not refrain from murdering people, but of course you can't get 5 or 6 from the necessitarian interpretation. So let me just kind of back up a little bit. I think what the necessitarian is going to say is when I say we ought not to murder others, what we're saying, and that Ted Bundy ought not to have done that. What we're essentially saying is that is bad. Murder is bad. We can know that because if everybody murdered each other, we wouldn't be here. Or we don't want to be murdered, so we don't want to be murdered. But it's certainly the case then that we can say that murder is bad. And so if somebody does murder somebody, we need to at least quarantine them, take them out of society so they don't do it again. Perhaps try to reform them, rehabilitate them in order to try to get them to be functional members of society. And then in general, we might think about Ted Bundy and understand that it's probably not the case that Ted Bundy looked at a whole bunch of options for his life and saw he could be, say, a terrible murderer, or say a really happy, wealthy person with everything that he wanted. And Ted Bundy then said, oh, I'm going to be the murderer. It's probably not the case that that's how murderers become murderers. Most people in prison are in prison because they had traumatic, awfully difficult childhoods. Many of them are mental health issues, addiction issues, none of which anybody would choose to have. And so what we start to see is with necessitarianism, we actually get a bit more of an empathetic account of people who are harming others. We start to see that actually we should understand, how this person ended up being where they are, and it's going to turn out that they probably had a traumatic childhood themselves, one that they didn't choose. And so to punish them, to claim that they ought to be different, that somehow after having this really crazy, awful childhood, they're going to become just upstanding citizens, that doesn't seem to be a very empathetic way and sympathetic way to understand why bad people do what they do.
Yeah.
So
So, yeah, that's interesting. So, I guess among other points, one of the central points there is that the necessitarian will reject the odd implies can principle that the argument rests on, essentially.
absolutely.
And so then let's go on to the final objection that we're going to be considering, which is the objection from principle of alternative possibilities, or PAP. According to PAP, one is responsible for an action only if one could have done otherwise than perform that action. Now, why might one believe this? Well, one might think that PAP is a nice explanation of our reaction in certain cases. So, for instance, take philosopher Philip Swenson's shark case. Suppose you are walking along the beach, you see a child drowning, and you evilly decide not to try to help the child. But unbeknownst to you, there were sharks in the water, and if you had tried to rescue the child, you would have been killed by the sharks, and the child would have drowned anyway. plausibly, you're responsible here for not trying to save the child, but you aren't responsible for the death of the child. And the question is, what's the best explanation of the fact that you're not responsible for the child's death?
Good.
The best explanation seems to be that you couldn't have done anything about it. And because of that, you're not responsible for failing to save the child. But importantly, you are responsible for not trying to save the child, precisely because you could have tried. So the thought goes. And since we seem obviously responsible for some actions, and since PAP is plausible in light of that shark case and the best explanation of it, and furthermore, since these two claims together imply Contingentarionism, because if you're responsible, then that means you could have done otherwise for choosing as you do, etc., it follows that we have good reason to accept Contingentarionism. So what do you make of this argument?
Good. So, of course, much of the argument, the PAP argument, rests upon a certain interpretation of what it means to be responsible. And if by responsible one means the PAP account of responsibility, well, then quite clearly the person in the example is responsible. But the PAP account explicitly presupposes Contingentarianism, right? You're talking about possible alternative ways things could have been. So take that out, and the necessitarian response could be one of two. The necessitarian might say, okay, so if responsibility has to entail PAP, well, then there's just no such thing as responsibility. But the necessitarian could also say that responsibility doesn't have to entail the PAP. Instead, to say that a person is responsible means that when a person harms another, whether actively or inactively, then we need to do something about that person to prevent them from doing it again in the future. And again, we do so by quarantining them or rehabilitating them, teaching them how to be a functional member, talking to them, reprimanding them, as a way of hopefully affecting future actions.
Awesome. Okay, so again, for the audience, there are more objections we could consider and go, back and forth on and so on. In fact, I prepared more in the I do discussion briefs for these conversations, and I even prepared more objections, but for the sake of time, onwards we march now to the case for necessitarianism. So I'll just turn it over to you, Dr. Karofsky, if you have any preliminary comments, and also if you want to go through, let's say, the grounding argument.
Good, good. So the book as a whole works to prove or provide a case for necessitarianism. In the first chapter, I show that there's no good reason to think that anything is contingent. In the second chapter, I argue that there can be no good theory, no good explanation for contingency. In the third chapter, I provide arguments showing that there is good reason to think that necessitarianism is true. And then in the fourth chapter, I provide some objections and then replies to those objections that are commonly raised against necessitarianism. So I take it that the book as a whole works to provide the case. So in that third chapter, I then provide several arguments that work to provide some good reason to think that necessitarianism is true. And the first argument that I'll talk about is the grounding argument. So grounding has been kind of the one of the elements in metaphysics that's been focused on a lot lately. There are many different ways to understand grounding, but the way that I'm going to use it is to understand that grounding is essentially the same as explanation. So when we say that one entity grounds another, we're saying that it essentially explains why it exists, how it exists, and how it got to be. So when we start thinking about the universe or the entities in the universe, we can see that we can immediately see that everything that exists or everything that is it's either going to be that it is can't be otherwise in any way whatsoever, or it could be otherwise in some way. So every entity is either necessary or it's contingent. Now, contingency requires a further explanation. So there has to be some explanation why it is as it is. But of course, a necessity does too, but then a contingency has a second point that it could have been otherwise. And so a contingency requires some further explanation for the fact that it could have been otherwise than it actually is. That is, what in virtue of which a contingency is such that it is rather than not. Now, what I then go on to do is to say that let's try to think about what could account for a contingency. Well, it can't be another contingency, because that contingency would then need another contingency, which would need another contingency, but that would end up in an infinite series of contingent entities, each of which is contingent because of its previous contingent entity. But there can't but I argue no contingency can be adequately explained by an infinite series of contingencies. But I also argue that you can't have a brute or fundamental contingent entity, that is, a contingency that doesn't have some further explanation for its being such as it is rather than otherwise. But because an entity can only be either further grounded in something or not, that seems to suggest that the contingent entity has no adequate explanation for it whatsoever, no grounding. So the contingency of an entity can't be explained by a necessity either, because what is rooted in necessity is thereby necessary. So it turns out that there's nothing that can account for the contingency of any entity. It can't be rooted in a contingent entity. It can't be rooted in a necessary entity. So there's nothing in which a contingent entity can be rooted or grounded. And that means that nothing is contingent, and Contingentarianism is false. And therefore, every entity is necessary, and Necessitarianism is true then.
Yeah, that's a very clear articulation of the argument. So I as I was sort of understanding it and writing it down here, has maybe a few premises. One is like the contingency of an entity. The fact that it is contingent requires an explanation. The second premise would be something like, well, no amount of piling upon contingent things can explain the contingency of a given entity. You're kind of just infinitely deferring the explanation there. And so, and moreover, nothing necessary could explain it, because something that which is rooted in, or that which obtains in virtue of something necessary is, as you argue, itself necessary, and so the contingency of the entity can't be rooted in something necessary. So it can't be rooted in or explained by either contingencies or necessities. But since it requires an explanation, and since everything is either contingent or necessary, you can't have an explanation. So we get an absurdity, basically, on the supposition that there are contingent entities, because they require an explanation, but they can't have an explanation, because any explanation would be either contingent or necessity, and it can't be either for the reasons that we just surveyed. So it's sort of like a reductio of the supposition that there are contingent entities of sorts. So, yeah, see, it's somewhat similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's interestingly similar to, an argument that a lot of people have developed with respect to the PSR, that let's just say every contingent thing, its existence requires an explanation. Now, you focus on the contingency of it requiring an explanation. And, some people argue that, well, hey, if you say also that if the existence of every contingent thing requires an explanation, well, you can't explain that in terms of solely contingent things, but also you can't explain it in terms of something necessary. And so you get the kind of problem that people have developed. And I just want to point out to the broader literature that, this is an argument, a force to be reckoned with, that has been, there's a blossoming literature on it. So it's an important kind of consideration. Yeah, so I guess one way that someone might push back is to try to say that, hey, maybe the contingency of an entity can be rooted in something that's necessary. So maybe you could take Dr. Kenny Pierce. He's a philosopher. Highly recommend all of his work. He's been on lots of my friends' channels. He's really great. So shout out to Kenny Pierce. He is developing and has developed this view on which grounding can be a kind of indeterministic relation, where the same ground or the same kind of explanation in precisely the same circumstances might not have grounded what it in fact grounds. So in his view, you can basically have a grounding style explanation for something, even though it's a kind of indeterministic link. And so you don't get the consequence that a contingent thing can't be rooted or grounded in something necessary. Because, the necessary thing might not be such that the grounding is a kind of necessitating relation. So it might only contingently give rise to it. So I wonder what you think about that kind of pushback.
Yeah, there's that contingentarian assumption that what happens indeterminately could have happened otherwise, and they'd have to show that first. which is in many ways what my argument is saying. If you're going to claim that something could have happened otherwise, you've got to provide some evidence for it. You can't just assume that what happens indeterminately could have happened otherwise.
Yeah, okay, so that's one kind of pushback that someone might level, and as always, philosophical dialectic can go back and forth, almost ad infinitum. The next kind of pushback that I just want to briefly mention is kind of like a symmetry argument or a symmetry objection, and the idea is that, well, hey, if the necessitarian is demanding that the contingentarian must provide an explanation of, or must provide an accounting of that in virtue of which an entity is contingent, well, then the necessitarian must surely provide an explanation or an accounting of that in virtue of which an entity is necessary. So we can ask, what makes something necessary? And as one might think, in the case of contingentarianism, there don't seem to be any good candidates here without accepting an infinite regress of necessities or else brute necessity. And those might be problematic for the same reasons that the contingency is. So anyway, how do you respond to that kind of symmetry objection?
Okay, good. So I take it on, again, as a necessitarian, throwing away that contingentarian ladder, I take it that those kinds of questions and worries only make sense for the contingentarian. The above objections that the objections that you just said don't make sense to the necessitarian, because for the necessitarian, there is no difference between an entity and a necessary entity. It's only on contingentarianism that there's a difference between them. And similarly for the necessitarian, the question, what makes something necessary, doesn't make any sense. It's actually a loaded question. Just as I can't answer the question, how many times did I beat my dog yesterday, because I don't beat my dog. So too, the question why or in virtue of what are actual things such that they couldn't have been otherwise is a question that I can't answer, because I don't think it's possible that things could have been otherwise. And so in this way, it's the question is in some sense loaded. It presupposes the contingentarian assumption that it's possible for actual things to have been otherwise. And it's an assumption that I take to be false. But it's also interesting to note that when the contingentarian assumption that what is actual could have been otherwise, when that assumption is set aside, there's actually no need to show that what is actual couldn't have been otherwise. So let me just put it a little bit different way. In this way, the question presupposes that there can be a distinction between what is actual and what couldn't have been otherwise. And also that an entity that could have one that is actual could have one property but not the other. So for the contingentarian, we can distinguish between explaining why something exists or is in a certain way from explaining the thing's modal status and what grounds such status. And it's interesting that when philosophers talk about modalities, we're talking about notions of possibility and impossibility, contingency and necessity. And so, yeah, this objection is asking the necessitarian to explain not only why something is the way that it is, but also to explain why that something is necessarily the way that it is. But on the necessitarian account that I'm defending, there is no such distinction between why something exists and the thing's modal status. For the necessitarian, the phrase "what is actual" amounts to just the same as couldn't have been otherwise. Indeed, to say that an actual entity is such that it couldn't have been otherwise is in many ways just repetitive. It just kind of provides some further emphasis that's only needed when talking to contingentarians. So when a necessitarian says of an entity that it is as it is and couldn't have been otherwise, that last part is just redundant and not needed. It's really just the same as saying that the entity is as it is, and that's it.
Awesome. Well, let's get on to the second, because we're very closely running out of time, but let's get to the second argument that I think we'd like to cover, which is the kind of simplicity and Occam's razor point. So you basically argued that necessitarianism is superior to contingentarianism with respect to like Occam's razor and simplicity considerations. So can you sort of take us through this line of reasoning?
Yeah. So the contingentarian has to make an awful lot of distinctions and posit an awful lot of entities. So if we talk about Occam's razor and the principle of simplicity, we're going to see that necessitarianism, when compared to contingentarianism, is going to, in essence, win the battle with the determination, with Occam's razor being the determiner. So think about contingentarianism. Contingentarianism, for a modal realist, you have an infinite number of possible worlds. You have a difference between possible worlds and actual worlds. You have a difference between possibility, necessity, impossibility, contingency. You've got necessary truths and possible truths. You've got different degrees of necessity, absolute necessity, hypothetical necessity, conditional necessity. There are so many distinctions that the contingentarian has to provide in order to try to get that contingentarian theory going. For the necessitarian, there's just what there is, and that's it. What is not is impossible. For the necessitarian, what is real is the same as what is true, is the same as what exists, is the same as what is in fact the case. We don't have to make any distinctions there. For the necessitarian, all properties are what philosophers call essential properties, and we don't have to make a distinction between essential and accidental properties. So when we start to examine the two theories, we're going to see that the necessitarian account requires very few distinctions. It just needs to distinguish between what is and what is not. And the contingentarian account has to include so many different distinctions, so many different entities, that the appealing to Occam's razor to determine which of the two theories is the better one necessitarianism is just going to win hands down every time.
Interesting. So we've covered arguments against necessitarianism, arguments for contingentarianism. Now we've covered arguments for necessitarianism and against contingentarianism. For the audience, a lot more arguments on both sides are considered in Dr. Karofsky's book, A Case for Necessitarianism, which is again linked in the description. I've also linked Dr. Karofsky's Fill People profile with her other work in the description, so check that out. Do you have any concluding comments before we end this? And I'll do my little outro, but you can stick around after that as well. So any concluding comments?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only comment I would make is just to try for a day to walk around thinking like a necessitarian, and I can promise you that your head is not going to explode. I'm doing just fine as I look around the world and think of it as the only way that things could be, and I think you can too.
Awesome. Okay. So for the audience, if you enjoyed that, please smash that like button, turn on that little bell for notifications, and if you see value in the work that I do, and hey, if you've made it this far, you probably do see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon or through a one-time donation. All and any support, it means so much to me, and it helps so much. So thank you guys. It'll be helping me through grad school. So thank you all, and I guess what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.